That day started like any other. I had just finished making breakfast when my phone vibrated on the kitchen table. At first, I did not answer it. I was still thinking about my grocery list and Ethan's school schedule. Then the phone vibrated again, longer this time, and an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I looked at the screen and realized the number was unfamiliar. For reasons I could not explain, my hands felt cold as I pressed the answer button. The voice on the other end sounded formal and careful. The caller introduced himself and clearly said my name. After that, the words that followed felt disconnected, as if they refused to come together. I stood still, holding my breath, forcing myself to process every sentence. When he said Ethan's name, my legs weakened. I had to grab the chair to keep from falling. I did not scream, I did not cry. I simply listened until the call ended. A few minutes later, I was sitting on the kitchen floor. The clock on the wall kept ticking, almost mocking the reality I had just heard. I stared at the clean tiles, wondering how the world could keep moving when my life had stopped. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy. I felt like a stranger inside my own home. I do not remember how long I sat there. What I remember is the silence too large and overwhelming. There were no small footsteps from Ethan, no questions about his lunch, no laughter. I stood up and walked to his room. The door was half open, just like always. His bed was neatly made. His school bag still hung behind the door. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt right. I touched the bedsheet with my fingertips. There was no warmth. That was when the pressure in my chest tightened. Tears started falling without permission. I sat on the edge of his bed and covered my face with both hands. I did not know what to do. There was no guide for moments like this. No words strong enough to hold back a loss that arrived without warning. A few hours later, I found myself doing small things with no clear purpose. I made tea and let it grow cold. I opened the window and closed it again. I tried calling someone, then ended the call before it connected. I knew I should tell my parents, but my mind was blank. I was not ready to hear their voices. I was not ready to explain something I could not yet understand myself. The day moved slowly. In the late afternoon, someone came to the house to discuss practical matters. I listened, nodded, and signed several documents. Words like report and procedure felt distant, as if they had nothing to do with my child. I answered questions briefly because speaking felt exhausting. Every sentence took effort. Night arrived without warning. I sat alone in the living room with the lights on and the television off. I stared at the wall, trying to remember Ethan's face the last time I saw him. The memory came in fragments, mixed with guilt I could not fully explain. I asked myself whether I should have done something differently. The question repeated in my mind, even though I knew no answer could change what had happened. Eventually, I sent a short message to my parents. I wrote in simple sentences without details. I did not want to say too much. I just wanted them to know. After sending it, I placed my phone face down. I did not wait for a reply. I did not want to see the screen light up. At that moment, all I wanted was sleep, even though I knew it would not come easily. In bed, I stared at the ceiling. Every corner of the house reminded me of routines that were now gone. I realized that, from this day forward, my life would be different. There was no plan that prepared me for a loss like this. There was no strength that felt enough. I knew only one thing for certain. I was Ethan's mother, and even though he was gone, my responsibility to him was not over. I closed my eyes, breathing in short, shallow breaths. I did not pray with long words. I simply hoped to get through the night without completely falling apart. In the silence, I made a promise to myself to survive one more day. For that moment, that was enough. Morning arrived without bringing any sense of relief. I woke up out of habit, not because I felt rested. My eyes were heavy, my head ached, and my body felt stiff. For a few seconds, I almost forgot what had happened. Then reality hit again, pressing down on my chest. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wishing time would stop moving. I eventually got up and walked into the kitchen. My steps were slow, as if this house no longer belonged to me. The clock on the wall showed the time Ethan usually got ready for school. Without thinking, I began preparing breakfast like I always did. I poured cereal into a bowl, then stopped. I stared at it for a long moment before putting it back in the cupboard. My hands were shaking, and I had to take a deep breath to keep from collapsing into a chair. The house felt different in the morning. There was usually a small voice asking questions, the sound of running feet, doors opening and closing. Today, all of that was gone. Silence filled every corner. I tried turning on the radio to break the emptiness, but turned it off again after a few minutes. Hearing other people talk felt unbearable. I walked to Ethan's room again, even though I knew there would be nothing new to find. I stood in the doorway, looking at the room from a distance. I could not bring myself to step inside. There was a fear I could not explain, as if entering the room would force me to accept something I was not ready to face. I closed the door slowly and leaned against the wall, letting my body slide down to the floor. A short while later, my phone vibrated. Messages came in, followed by calls I did not answer. I knew they were from people who had heard the news. I opened none of them. I was not ready to talk. I was not ready to explain. I did not even know what I would say if someone asked how I was doing. I silenced the phone and placed it inside a drawer. I spent the day doing simple tasks without direction. I washed dishes that were already clean. I swept the same spot on the floor twice. I straightened the sofa cushions, then messed them up again. I did all of this to avoid my thoughts. Every time I stopped moving, Ethan's image appeared without warning. Around midday, someone knocked on the door. I startled, then felt irritated with myself for reacting that way. I opened the door to find a neighbor holding food. She spoke softly, carefully choosing her words. I thanked her and took the container without saying much. I did not want to seem rude, but I also did not want small talk. After closing the door, I set the food on the table and left it untouched. I sat on the couch and stared out the window. Outside, people were living their lives as usual. Cars passed by, children walked home from school, and the world kept moving without waiting for me. The sight made me angry, then exhausted. I knew the world owed me nothing, yet it was hard to accept that other lives remained normal while mine had fallen apart. In the afternoon, I finally checked my phone. There were many unread messages. I scrolled slowly without really reading them, only recognizing familiar names. I locked the screen again when I saw my parents' names appear. I was not ready to face them. I did not know if I wanted to hear their voices, let alone explain something I could not yet explain to myself. I realized I had not cried again since morning. The tears felt trapped somewhere I could not reach. In their place was a hollow feeling that refused to leave. I felt like I was waiting for something to happen, even though I knew nothing could change what had already happened. The waiting was exhausting, yet I could not stop doing it. Night came sooner than I expected. I turned on lights in several rooms so the house would not feel too dark. I ate a small amount of food just to keep myself from feeling dizzy, then cleaned the kitchen without any energy. After that, I sat on the edge of the bed, looking around a room that felt far too large for one person. I thought about the days ahead and felt afraid. I did not know how to live without Ethan. Before going to bed, I opened the drawer and picked up my phone again. I read my parents' message once more. It was brief, asking how I was and saying they had heard the bad news. There were no details, no emotion. I closed the phone without replying. I needed time, and I knew that time could not be rushed. I lay down and closed my eyes, even though sleep felt impossible. In the silence, I realized something. This loss was not only about grief. It was about learning how to breathe in a world that had suddenly changed. I did not know when I would be ready to talk, laugh, or feel normal again. For now, making it to the next morning already felt like a great effort. The day of the funeral arrived almost without notice. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm, but because my mind had never truly rested. The morning air felt cold, and the house was still silent. I stood in the bathroom for a long time, staring at the mirror without really seeing my reflection. My face looked unfamiliar, pale and worn. I splashed water on my face several times, hoping the heavy feeling in my chest would ease, even slightly. I put on the black clothes I had prepared the night before. My movements were slow and careful, as if one wrong step might cause everything to fall apart. In the living room, several chairs had already been arranged neatly. Flowers sat on a small table near the door. I could not remember who sent them. I only knew that I had to leave the house and get through that day, even though I had no idea how. The drive to the cemetery passed in silence. I sat in the front seat, staring at the road without focus. Trees, buildings, and traffic lights passed by as they always did. Everything looked the same as any other day, and that was what hurt the most. The world had not changed, even though my life had collapsed. When I arrived, several people were already waiting. Familiar faces greeted me with expressions full of sympathy. Some offered brief hugs, others only nodded softly. I said thank you again and again, though the words felt empty. I did not want long conversations. I only wanted it to be over. The service was simple. There was no excessive music and no long speeches. I stood in the front row, clasping my hands together to keep them from shaking. The small casket was only a few steps away from me. I stared at it without blinking, trying to accept the reality that my child was there. It made no sense, and I knew it probably never would. As I stood there, my eyes instinctively searched for two faces I had not seen since arriving. I looked behind me, then to the side. My parents were not there. I tried to think they might be late. I tried to convince myself they would arrive any moment. I waited until the service was almost over. They never came. Disappointment settled in slowly, mixed with deep exhaustion. I did not want to create tension on that day. I did not want to call or ask questions. I chose to focus on one thing only, giving Ethan a proper farewell. I stood until the very end, even though my legs felt weak. After it was over, people approached one by one to say goodbye. Some spoke words of comfort I had already heard many times. I nodded and offered a small smile, even though it felt forced. I did not blame them. No sentence could truly lessen a loss like this. I stayed longer after most people had left. I stood alone near the grave, staring at the freshly turned soil. I spoke quietly without sound. I said the things I never had the chance to say. I promised to protect everything he left behind. I did not know if that promise made sense, but I needed it in that moment. On the way home, my phone vibrated. A message came from my parents. It was brief. They said they could not come because they were not emotionally able to handle it. They hoped I would understand. I read the message once and then put the phone away. I did not reply. I did not know how to answer without saying something I would regret. When I arrived home, the exhaustion hit immediately. The house was silent again, but this time it felt heavier. I took off my shoes and sat on the floor near the door. I did not cry. I simply sat there, staring at the empty space in front of me. My parents' absence that day felt like an unnecessary wound, yet it was real. That night, I opened their message again. I reread the same lines, trying to see them from their perspective. I knew they had also lost a grandchild. I knew everyone handled grief differently. Still, there was a part of me that felt abandoned. I chose to keep that feeling to myself. Before going to bed, I arranged a few small items I had brought back from the funeral. I placed them neatly on the table. There was no special ritual. I only wanted things to look orderly, even if my thoughts were not. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, feeling that the day had finally ended. The funeral was over, but the true weight of the loss was only beginning. I knew the days ahead would not be easy. I also knew I would have to face many things I had not yet allowed myself to think about. For that night, I only wanted to rest. I closed my eyes, carrying one bitter truth I could not escape. I had said goodbye to my child, and my life would never be the same again. The day after the funeral felt quieter than before. There were no more preparations, no more people coming and going. The house was fully mine again, and that was exactly what made it hard to breathe. I woke up in the morning feeling empty. My body moved out of habit, not desire. I made coffee and let it grow cold on the table. I sat there for a long time, staring at the cup without touching it. My thoughts kept returning to the day before. Not to the ceremony or the words people had said, but to the empty chairs where my parents should have been. I tried to remember the last time they had missed an important moment in my life. Never. That was why their absence felt so noticeable. I did not want to judge them right away. I left room for whatever reasons they might have had. By midday, I decided to read their message again. I went through it slowly, trying to understand what lay behind the brief sentences. They said they could not bear to see the small coffin. They wrote that they were afraid they would lose control. They mentioned distance and physical condition, saying it all felt too heavy. There was no clear apology, only explanations that fell flat. I set my phone down and walked into the living room. I sat on the sofa that had been filled with people the day before. Now there was only me and the silence. I tried to place myself in their position. They were old. They had lost a grandchild too. Maybe the pain was too much for them. The thought made sense, but it did not fully ease the feeling inside me. In the end, I called them. I did not want a long conversation. I only wanted to hear their voices and make sure there was no misunderstanding. My mother answered. Her voice was quiet, as if she were choosing each word carefully. She said the same things she had written in the message. She repeated that she could not bring herself to attend and hoped I would understand. I listened without interrupting. My father spoke after her. His tone was firmer but still controlled. He said they had considered the decision carefully. He said their presence would not have changed anything and might have made things worse. I did not agree, but I did not argue. I told them I understood, even though the words felt heavy as they left my mouth. I did not want to argue. I did not want to add another conflict while my grief was still raw. I chose to keep my disappointment to myself. The call ended quickly and awkwardly. There were no tears, no warmth, just polite words that felt distant. After I hung up, I felt more tired than before. I did not feel relieved. I felt alone. I realized that understanding does not always mean accepting. A distance had formed not because of anger, but because of the choice they had made. I tried to convince myself that time would fix everything. That afternoon, I put away some of the remaining items from the funeral. I placed the condolence cards into a drawer. I moved the flowers that were starting to wilt outside. The simple tasks helped me keep moving. I did not want to sit still and think about the same things again. Staying still for too long sent my thoughts in directions I did not want. When night came, I thought again about the conversation with my parents. Part of me wanted a clearer apology. Another part wanted to forgive without conditions. I was caught between the two. I did not want to cut ties, but I could not pretend I was not hurt. I wrote a long reply on my phone, then deleted it. I tried a shorter version and deleted that too. No sentence felt right. In the end, I chose not to send anything. I needed time to understand my own feelings before sharing them with anyone else. That night, I slept restlessly. I woke up several times, thinking about small things I had never questioned before. I asked myself whether I was being too harsh or too forgiving. No answer felt satisfying. I realized that this loss had made every relationship feel fragile. The next morning, I woke up with one simple conclusion. I would accept their reasons, at least for now. Not because I fully agreed, but because I did not have the strength to fight. I chose to focus on what I could control. I would take care of myself and honor Ethan's memory in my own way. I knew that conversation had not closed anything. Some things were still unresolved and might surface again later. But for now, I chose to move slowly. I did not know if my decision was right, but it was the only one that felt possible. In the middle of fresh grief, surviving without creating new conflicts already felt like a great effort. A few days after the funeral, life began to move in a strange direction. There was no clear sign that I was moving forward, yet there were practical matters that could not be postponed. Letters started to arrive. Some were from offices, others from institutions whose names I had not heard in a long time. I stacked them all on the dining table and left them there for 2 days, as if by not opening them, the problems would disappear on their own. On the morning of the third day, I finally sat down and began reading them one by one. My hands still felt stiff, but my mind was clearer than it had been in the days before. There were documents about insurance, medical records, and one envelope that immediately caught my attention. It was from the financial institution managing the trust fund in Ethan's name. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The fund was not new to me. Ethan's father and I had set it up years ago, back when we still believed the future could be planned neatly. It was meant for his education, housing, and long-term security. After all the calculations, the amount reached $850,000. The number looked large on paper, but to me, its value had always been tied to a single purpose, my child's life. I read the explanation in the letter slowly. The language was stiff and formal, outlining the status of the fund after the beneficiary's death. Legally, the fund still existed and had to be managed according to regulations. There was no sentence that spoke of loss or grief. Everything was written in clean, cold terms. I understood why it had to be that way, yet it still felt strange to read my child's future reduced to administrative paragraphs. After finishing, I placed the letter back on the table. I looked around the house, trying to connect the words on paper with the reality in front of me. Ethan's room was still intact. His shoes were still on the rack. His favorite jacket still hung on the chair. The trust fund was still there, but my child was not. That imbalance made it hard for me to breathe. Later that afternoon, I received a call from the family lawyer. His voice was professional and careful. He asked whether I had received the documents that were sent. I replied briefly that I had read them. He explained several technical details about the next steps and emphasized that there was no need to rush any decisions. I appreciated his approach, even though the conversation was still exhausting. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I did not cry. I did not feel angry either. What I felt was the realization that a part of Ethan's life now rested entirely in my hands. The responsibility felt heavy, not because of the amount of money, but because of what it represented. I did not want to make a decision that would erase the original purpose of the fund. Toward evening, I opened messages from my parents that I had previously ignored. They asked about my condition again, this time with a slightly more attentive tone. I replied briefly, saying that I was fine and still trying to put myself back together. I did not mention the trust fund at all. I was not ready to talk about it with anyone, especially with them. I realized that since the funeral, our relationship had felt awkward. There were no long conversations, no visits. Everything was flat and formal. I tried to convince myself that this was normal, given the situation we were facing. Yet at the same time, a sense of caution began to grow, even though I did not yet know the reason for it. That night, I read through the trust fund documents again. I marked several important sections and wrote down questions on a separate sheet of paper. I wanted to make sure that any decision made later would be taken with a clear head. I did not want emotion to guide my steps, even though that was not easy. Loss often blurs the line between logic and feeling. Before going to bed, I stood in front of Ethan's room and opened the door. I went in and sat on the floor, leaning against his bed. I did not speak out loud, but in my heart, I told him that I would protect what he left behind. The fund was not a replacement for his presence, but it was a part of his life that I could still honor. That night I realized one important thing. Money can wait, Documents can be postponed and decisions can be reconsidered. But the value of all of it only matters if I remain faithful to the reason it was created in the first place. I do not know what test will come next, but I know one thing for certain. Whatever happens, I will not allow the memory of my child to be reduced to nothing more than numbers on a piece of paper. That morning passed like the mornings that came after it, directionless and without any clear purpose. I woke up with the same hollow feeling. There was no surprise, no hope that the day would feel lighter. I went through basic routines just to keep my body moving. I showered, got dressed, then sat at the kitchen table without touching anything. My mind would not settle on a single thought. Everything felt blurred. I had just finished wiping the table when my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen. My parents' names appeared. I froze where I stood. It had been several days since the funeral, and I had not spoken to them directly. Their short messages were still fresh in my memory, cold and brief, without much emotion. I stared at the screen for a long time, weighing whether I should answer or not. The vibration stopped, then started again. This time it lasted longer. I took a deep breath and finally answered the call. I did not know what I was expecting. Maybe an apology. Maybe a more human explanation. Or perhaps just a voice that sounded regretful. But from the first sentence, I knew the conversation would not be any of that. My mother's voice sounded calm, too calm. She asked how I was doing in a formal tone, as if we were talking about something ordinary. I answered briefly. I did not want to drag out an opening exchange that felt empty. Then my father joined the conversation. His tone was the same, flat and controlled. There was no pause that suggested grief or guilt. After a few meaningless sentences, the direction of the conversation shifted. My father mentioned something that immediately put me on alert. He brought up the fund I had set up for Ethan, the trust fund I had carefully maintained and rarely thought about. I went silent, trying to understand where this conversation was heading. He spoke slowly, as if choosing his words with care. He said the fund was a large amount. He also said that under the current circumstances, the money would no longer be used as originally planned. That sentence made my stomach turn. I gripped the phone tighter, holding myself back from interrupting him. Then my mother continued. She mentioned my younger sibling. She talked about an upcoming wedding and said the costs would not be small. Then, without hesitation, she said it would make sense for the fund to be used to help the family. She called it a logical solution. I did not respond right away. My mind struggled to catch up with the meaning of their words. It felt like I was listening to a conversation about someone else, not about my child. They spoke about the trust fund as if it were just an idle account, not something built from love and hope for Ethan's future. I finally asked them to repeat what they meant to make sure I had not misunderstood. My father repeated it more clearly. He said Ethan would not be using the money. He added that helping my sibling was the right thing to do as a family. He even said that Ethan would have wanted the money to be used for the family's benefit. That sentence hit me hard. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to contain the emotion rising inside me. I felt angry, but more than that, I felt insulted. My son had just died, and they were already talking about how to use what he had left behind. I replied in a low but firm voice. I said the fund belonged to Ethan. I said it was created for his future, not for any event or celebration. I did not state a final decision, but my tone made my disagreement clear. My mother sounded displeased. She said I was being too emotional. She said I was not thinking clearly because I was still grieving. My father added that I should be realistic. They spoke as if my feelings were the problem standing in the way of a sensible decision. I felt something shift inside me. The sadness that had dominated me began to give way to a cold, steady anger. I realized this conversation was not about helping the family. It was about their sense of entitlement to something that was not theirs. I ended the call quickly. I said I would not discuss this matter right now. I hung up before they could add anything else. My hands were shaking as I placed the phone on the table. My chest felt tight, not from tears but from anger held back. I sat there for a long time afterward. The house felt quieter than ever. Not because of Ethan's absence, but because of a new realization taking shape. I understood that my parents' absence at the funeral was not just about grief. There was a deeper distance than I had ever acknowledged. The day passed with little activity. I did not call anyone. I did not reply to any messages. My thoughts kept returning to that conversation. Every sentence replayed in my head, and each time it did, my resolve hardened. That night, I sat alone in the living room. I stared at the phone lying on the table, aware that the call had permanently changed something. I had not made a final decision yet, but one thing was already clear. I would not allow my child's name to be tied to greed. Whatever came next, I knew my family relationships would never be the same again. The call came in the late afternoon, when the house was at its quietest. I was sitting at the dining table with a cup of tea that had already gone cold when my phone vibrated. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. Part of me wanted to let it ring until it stopped, but I knew I could not keep avoiding it. My mother's voice sounded calm, too calm. She asked how I was doing in a tone that felt formal, like she was speaking to someone she barely knew. I replied briefly, saying I was fine, even though that was not entirely true. My father then took over the conversation. He asked the same question and moved on to another topic without any natural pause. He began talking about family matters. He mentioned my younger sister, who was preparing for her wedding. I listened without interrupting, even though I did not understand where the conversation was heading. Then my father said something that made me sit up straight. He mentioned Ethan's trust fund. He stated the amount clearly, as if it were just a number, not a part of my child's life that had been lost. I did not respond right away. My mind needed time to process what I was hearing. My mother joined in, saying that the money was no longer needed for its original purpose. She spoke in a reasonable tone, as if discussing something unused. They said the fund could be used to help with my sister's wedding so it could proceed properly without burdening too many people. I felt my blood rush. My hand tightened around the phone. I asked if they realized what they were talking about. My father answered defensively. He said they were only thinking practically. He added that family should help one another, especially in a situation like this. The words sounded cold and completely out of place. I tried to speak calmly. I explained that the fund was created specifically for Ethan. The money was not mine, not theirs, and was never meant for anything else. My mother interrupted, saying that legally there might be a way. She said that as close family, we could reach an agreement together. Her tone sounded like she was negotiating. The conversation turned into something that made it hard for me to breathe. They began reminding me of my childhood, of the sacrifices they had made as parents. They talked about how they had helped me in the past, as if all of that now had to be repaid. I listened while holding back my emotions, trying not to raise my voice. I finally said that I would not discuss this now. I told them the timing was wrong. I was still grieving and not ready to talk about money. My father sounded dissatisfied. He said there is never a right time for topics like this, but they still need to be discussed. That sentence made me realize that, for them, grief and money could exist in the same breath. I ended the conversation by saying I would think about everything. After the call ended, I placed the phone on the table and covered my face with my hands. My chest felt tight. I did not just feel sad, I felt betrayed. I never expected them to bring up that topic so soon and in that way. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated again. This time it was a long message from my mother. She repeated their reasons and emphasized that this was for the family. She wrote that Ethan would surely want to help his aunt. That sentence made me tremble. They spoke as if they understood my child's heart better than I did. I stood up and paced around the living room. Every corner of the house reminded me of Ethan. His toys, his photos, his belongings were still there. All of it made the earlier conversation feel even more unreasonable. It felt as though they were trying to erase Ethan as existence and replace it with other needs. That night, I did not reply to any messages. I turned off my phone and put it in a drawer. I knew this conversation was not over. I knew they would contact me again, but for that moment, I chose silence. I needed space to think and to calm myself. I sat on the sofa until late at night, staring at the room without really seeing it. The conversation kept replaying in my mind. Every sentence felt heavier than the last. I began to realize that losing Ethan was not the only thing I had to face. Another conflict was waiting, and it was coming from the people who should have been on my side. When I finally lay down in bed, my thoughts were still racing. I did not know how our relationship would move forward after this. I did not know whether they would ever understand my decision, but one thing was becoming clear. Whatever happens next, I have to protect what belongs to Ethan. There is no reason strong enough to sacrifice that, not even in the name of family. I did not immediately notice when anger began to replace grief. At first, it was only exhaustion, then it turned into a sense of discomfort every time my phone vibrated. Messages from my parents started arriving more frequently. They were no longer just asking how I was doing. They began asking about practical matters, about issues they believed needed to be settled soon. I read each message with mixed emotions, then put my phone down without replying. My day started to follow a strange pattern. I woke up in the morning, cleaned the house, then sat for too long without any purpose. I tried to return to working from home, but I struggled to concentrate. Every time I opened my laptop, my thoughts drifted to things I did not want to remember. I closed the screen and chose instead to organize old files stored in the cabinet. That was when everything shifted. Among the stacks of documents, I found a brown folder I had not opened in a long time. Inside were the papers related to Ethan's trust fund. I sat on the floor and read them slowly. Every page reminded me of the plans we once made. Education, housing, a future that was supposed to be long. I closed the folder with a heavy breath and put it away again. I did not want to think about it then, but my mind had already gone there. That afternoon, my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Her voice sounded calm, too calm for a situation like this. She asked how I was doing, then moved straight into another topic without pause. I listened in silence, trying to understand where the conversation was heading. She began talking about my sister, about her wedding plans, which were getting closer, about the costs, which were not small. I felt uneasy, but I stayed quiet. Then she mentioned Ethan's trust fund. Her tone became more cautious, as if she were bringing up something sensitive but long considered. She said the money was no longer being used for its original purpose. She suggested it might be better if the fund helped the family members who were still alive. She used words like responsibility and togetherness. Every sentence sounded cold to me. I waited, hoping she would stop, but she kept going. I finally interrupted her. I asked if that was really what she wanted to talk about. She fell silent for a moment, then said yes. She said this was not an easy time, but in her view, it was a realistic discussion. I felt something break inside me, something I had been holding back for a long time. I said quietly that it was inappropriate. The fund belonged to Ethan. It did not belong to the family, it did not belong to my sister, and it did not belong to anyone except my child. My mother tried to argue. She said I was being too emotional and not thinking clearly. She reminded me that family members are supposed to help each other, especially during difficult times. I closed my eyes as I listened. I felt at a loss for words. Not because I did not know what to say, but because I never expected this conversation to happen. I ended the call sooner than usual. I did not say goodbye. After that, my hands were shaking badly. I sat on the sofa for a long time trying to calm myself. Thoughts about the funeral returned, about their absence, about the short message they had sent. Everything began to feel connected. I started to realize that their absence might not have been just emotional inability, but a deeper distance I had not wanted to see. That night, my father sent a message. It supported what my mother had said. His tone was firm, telling me I needed to act like an adult. He wrote that money served no purpose if it was only left unused. That sentence made my chest burn. I did not reply. I put my phone down and paced around the house. I felt torn. On one side they were my parents. On the other, their request felt like a betrayal. I thought about Ethan. I thought about his face, his voice, the way he hugged me. There was no part of me that could accept his legacy being used for something that had nothing to do with him. I opened the brown folder again and read everything more carefully. I wanted to make sure I understood every detail. I wanted to know my rights and responsibilities. I read until late at night. When I finished, I felt more certain. That fund could not and should not be used carelessly. Before going to bed, I wrote a short message to my parents. I chose my words carefully, making them clear without sounding harsh. I told them I would not discuss the matter again. I said this decision was not made out of anger, but out of responsibility as a mother. I pressed send with a long breath. I lay in bed, my body exhausted. I knew that message would change many things. I knew our relationship would never be the same. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt that I was standing in the right place. I might have lost many things, but I would not lose my respect for my own child. I didn't immediately notice the change. At first, it felt like ordinary conversations that were slightly awkward. Messages from my parents began to arrive more often. Their tone was calm, even polite. They asked how I was doing, how my health was, and whether I had started to reorganize my life. I answered only what was necessary. I was still exhausted, and I didn't want to open the door to long conversations. A few days later, the direction of those conversations began to shift. They asked about things that felt too rushed. About documents, about legal matters. About everything that needed to be settled after someone died. I knew those questions were reasonable, but something in the way they asked made me uneasy. They never mentioned my feelings. They also stopped saying Ethan's name. I tried to stay positive. I told myself that maybe they were just awkward. Maybe they didn't know how to act. I chose to keep my replies brief and maintain emotional distance. I wasn't ready to face any pressure. My focus was simple: to survive each day without completely falling apart. One afternoon, my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated for a few seconds before answering. Her voice sounded warmer than usual. She asked if I had eaten. I replied vaguely. Then she began talking about my younger sister. About her wedding plans that had been postponed. About how important the event was for the family. I listened without interrupting. I still didn't understand where the conversation was going. Then my mother said that things were not easy for the family right now. There were many expenses to consider. She repeated the word future several times. I started to feel tense, but I stayed silent. My father then took over the conversation. His tone was flat and controlled. He said they understood that I was grieving, but life had to go on. He brought up the trust fund in Ethan's name. He said that the money was now entirely my responsibility. I didn't react right away. I just listened, trying to understand what he was really saying. Then he said the fund was a large amount and would no longer be used for its original purpose. He said it would be better if the money helped the family members who were still alive. He mentioned my sister's wedding directly. I felt as if I wasn't fully present. His words were clear, but their meaning was hard to accept. They were talking about my child's money as if it were a family reserve fund. There was no pause, no empathy. No acknowledgement that the money was tied to a child who had just been buried. I finally asked, in a voice I tried to keep calm, whether they were serious. My mother answered quickly, saying they were only making a suggestion. They considered it a logical decision. They said Ethan would not need it anymore. That sentence made my chest tighten. I wasn't angry, at least not then. Instead, I felt cold. A distance suddenly formed between me and them. I realized that we saw this loss very differently. To me, Ethan was my son. To them, he had become a financial consideration. My father began talking about family obligations, about everything they had done for me in the past, about how I should help my sister during an important moment in her life. His words sounded like pressure wrapped in concern. I recognized the pattern. I had experienced it before, but this time the stakes were far too high. I said I needed time to think. I told them I wasn't ready to discuss this. My voice trembled, but I tried to stay clear. My mother sounded disappointed. She said I was too consumed by grief and unable to see the bigger picture. The conversation ended without agreement. I hung up and placed my phone on the table. My hands were shaking. I sat still for a long time, staring at the empty space in front of me. I didn't cry. I felt angry, confused, and hurt all at once. That night, messages began to come in. From my father, from my mother, even from my sister. The words varied, but the message was the same. They tried to persuade me. They said I was selfish. They said I was being excessive in protecting something that no longer had an owner. I read everything without replying. I felt as though my position was being tested, not as a grieving mother, but as a family member expected to comply. The pressure was real and heavy. I realized this was no longer just about money. It was about boundaries I had never clearly drawn before. I stood up and walked into Ethan's room. I sat on the floor, leaning against his bed. I remembered every reason that trust fund existed. Every plan I had once made so carefully. That fund was not a symbol of wealth. It was a symbol of hope, hope that never had the chance to become real. That was when I knew I could not give in. Not out of stubbornness, but because I was the only one left to protect what could still be protected. The pressure from my family would likely grow stronger, I could already feel it. But for the first time since Ethan was gone, I was certain of one thing. I would not allow this loss to be exploited by anyone. The phone rang again in the late afternoon, as the sunlight in the living room began to fade. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. I knew this conversation could no longer be postponed. There was something that had to be settled, even though I was not fully ready. I took a deep breath, then answered the call with a voice I forced to sound calm. My mother's voice was firmer than before. There was no small talk. She immediately brought up our last conversation about the trust fund in Ethan's name. My father joined in, adding reasons that sounded carefully planned. They mentioned my sister's wedding expenses, which kept increasing, pressure from extended family, and the embarrassment if the event failed to meet expectations. I listened without interrupting, letting them finish one sentence after another. I waited until they stopped talking. There was a brief pause, as if they were expecting my agreement. In that moment, I realized they had assumed my refusal was nothing more than temporary emotion. They believed I would eventually give in if they pushed long enough. That realization made me strangely calm. I knew exactly what I needed to say. I replied softly but clearly. I said the money was not mine to distribute. It was created for Ethan, for a future he never had the chance to live. I mentioned that the amount was large, about $850,000, but that was not the point. What mattered was the meaning behind it. I would not turn the loss of my child into a party budget. My mother tried to interrupt, saying the money would serve no purpose if it was left untouched. I stopped her politely. I explained that the money would still have a purpose. I had decided to direct it according to the values I held when the fund was created. Part of it would go to children's charities, and part to educational programs that support other families. This was not a rushed decision. I had thought about it carefully, night after night. My father then changed his tone. He reminded me of the sacrifices they made raising me, of the help they had given me during difficult times. He said families should support one another. I listened until he finished, then responded without emotion. I thanked them for everything they had done, but past sacrifices did not give them the right to ask me to betray my child now. The conversation grew tense. even without raised voices. Their words became sharper. They accused me of being stubborn, heartless, and of ruining my sister's happiness. I held myself back from responding in the same tone. I repeated only one thing calmly and consistently: my decision would not change. There was silence on the other end of the line. I could feel their disappointment and the anger they were holding back. Finally, my mother said that if I continued to insist, our relationship would change. She did not say it as a threat, but as a statement. I nodded, even though they could not see me. I had already considered that possibility. I told them I loved them, but I had to stand by what I believed was right. I was not asking for their agreement. I was only asking them to respect this boundary. If that was difficult, I would understand the distance that followed. Then I said goodbye and ended the call before the conversation could turn into something more painful. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time. My hands felt cold, but my mind was clearer than it had been in days. There was sadness, of course. No decision like this comes without consequences. But there was also a sense of relief I could not ignore. For the first time since Ethan died, I felt I was doing something that truly protected him. That night, I wrote several notes outlining my plan for the fund. I contacted the trust administrator and scheduled a meeting. I wanted everything handled properly and legally. I did not want any gaps that could be challenged later. I did all of this calmly, not out of anger. Before going to bed, I thought about my parents' reactions and how this would affect the days ahead. I knew there would be talk among the extended family. I knew my name might be mentioned in unkind ways. I accepted that possibility. I would rather face other people's judgment than live with regret over my own decision. In the quiet of my room, I looked at Ethan's photo on the small table. I spoke softly, telling him that I had made my choice. I was not asking for approval, only hoping he would know that his mother did not give in when what mattered most was at stake. I turned off the light feeling exhausted, but steady. The decision was made, and I was ready to face whatever came with it. The days after that conversation unfolded in a different way. There were no emotional outbursts and no open arguments, but the distance became unmistakable. I noticed it in small things. Messages that were once answered quickly were now left unread. Calls that used to come regularly stopped altogether. No one needed to tell me that my parents were disappointed. Their silence said enough. At first, I tried to act as if nothing had changed. I sent a short message to ask how they were doing. It was read, but never answered. I waited one day, then two. There was no response. I began to understand that my refusal had been taken as a betrayal. I was not surprised, but it still hurt. They were not just my parents. They were the only close family I had left. Sometime later, my sibling contacted me. Their tone was different from usual, colder and more measured. They did not ask how I was doing. They went straight to talking about our parents. They said our parents were deeply hurt by my decision. They said I had not thought about the family. I listened without interrupting, even as my chest felt tight. I did not defend myself. I simply said that my decision was final. The conversation ended in an awkward silence. After the call ended, I sat for a long time staring at my phone. I realized that my role in the family had changed. I was no longer the child who always gave in. I was no longer the older sibling who adjusted herself to keep the peace. I was now the one who said no, and the consequences were becoming real. I tried to distract myself with daily routines. I returned to work, even though my focus had not fully recovered. My colleagues were polite and careful. No one asked too many questions. I appreciated that. But every time I returned to my quiet house, thoughts of my family came back. Losing a child was already unbearable. Losing my relationship with my parents made the weight even heavier. One afternoon, I received a long message from my mother. It was filled with words that sounded like long-held disappointment. She wrote about the sacrifices they had made raising me. She wrote about their expectations of me as the eldest child. Not a single sentence mentioned Ethan. I read the message slowly, trying to find empathy in it, but all I found were demands. I replied carefully. I did not want to escalate the situation. I wrote that I understood their feelings, but I could not change my decision. I explained that the fund was part of my responsibility as a mother. I did not go into details about the money. I simply stated that I was acting to honor my child. After sending that message, I knew this distance would not be easy to repair. The following days grew even quieter. There were no dinner invitations, no weekend updates. I saw family posts on social media without myself included. I did not feel angry. I felt excluded. That feeling was different, colder, and more enduring. I began to understand that family relationships do not always survive when interests are challenged. In the midst of everything, I found small moments of calm in simple things. I walked in the mornings before work. I read before going to sleep. I rearranged parts of the house to make it feel lighter. I was not running from grief, but I was learning to manage it. I could not control how others behaved, but I could protect how I chose to endure. One night, I sat alone in the living room and thought about everything that had happened. I asked myself whether my decision was right. The question came back again and again, but the answer remained the same. I may have lost my family's support, but I did not lose my principles. I did not sacrifice Ethan's memory for anyone's approval. I realized that this wound would not heal quickly. My relationship with my parents might never return to what it once was, but within that pain, a kind of clarity emerged. I was no longer living to meet unfair expectations. I was living to face each day honestly with myself and with the child I once fought so hard to protect. I woke up that morning with a feeling different from the days before. Not because the sadness was gone, but because I was beginning to realize that life would not stop just because I wanted it to. The sense of loss was still there, now mixed with a deep lingering exhaustion. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the quiet of the house that had not changed, then took a deep breath before standing up. My days had changed. I no longer measured time by Ethan's school hours or his activity schedule. I organized my life around small things I could do on my own, making coffee, cleaning the house, answering messages only when necessary. Everything felt mechanical, but at least it gave me a reason to keep moving. My relationship with my parents was still distant. After the decision I made, there were no more long conversations. No late-night calls or messages filled with demands. At first, that silence hurt. I wondered if I had gone too far. But as time passed, I began to understand that the distance actually gave me room to breathe. I opened the old documents about Ethan's trust fund again. I read them calmly, making sure every decision I made aligned with the original intention. The fund was no longer a source of conflict, but a reminder of the future I had once prepared for him. I decided to direct the money toward things that reflected who Ethan was when he was alive: education, support for children in need, and programs that truly made a difference. The process was not easy. Every signature felt heavy. Every decision reminded me of the reality that Ethan would never grow up. Yet at the same time, there was a sense of peace in knowing I was doing the right thing. I was not turning my child's death into a transaction. I was protecting his dignity in the only way I knew how. A few months later, life slowly found its own rhythm. I returned to work, though with shorter hours. My colleagues did not ask many questions. They respected the boundaries I had set. I learned to talk about Ethan without crying every time. His name still hurt, but it no longer paralyzed me. One afternoon, I sat in a small park near my house. Children were playing, laughing, and running freely. I watched them from a distance. In the past, a scene like that would have made me leave immediately. Now, I could sit there longer. I was not happy watching them, but I was not shattered either. I simply accepted that the world kept moving, and I was still part of it. I still thought about my parents. There were days when longings surfaced, not for who they were now, but for the versions of them I once knew. Parents I believed would always stand by my side. I did not know if that relationship would ever heal. I also stopped forcing myself to find the answer. Some things do not return to what they once were. Nights became a time for reflection. I often sat alone, thinking about the journey I had walked since the day Ethan left. The loss changed how I saw family, responsibility, and love. I learned that not everyone is capable of showing up when we need them most. I also learned that surviving does not mean forgetting, but carrying memories in a way that does not destroy you. I no longer felt guilty about my decision. I knew others might see me as cold or unfeeling, but only I knew what had to be protected at that moment. I was Ethan's mother. My duty did not end when he was gone. My duty was to make sure his name was not used for something that went against the values of his life. One morning, I opened a small box containing Ethan's belongings. I took out the item he used most often. I held it for a moment, then smiled faintly. The smile was not full, but it was honest. I realized that this pain would always be there, but I did not have to live inside it every day. I do not know exactly what my future looks like. I only know that I have survived the hardest days I ever imagined. I am standing here now with wounds that are not fully healed, but with a stronger heart. I have lost my child, and I have also lost trust in some people. But I found something else, the courage to choose what is right, even when it means standing alone. My life did not return to what it was, and it may never do so. But I have learned to accept its new shape. I move forward slowly, carrying Ethan in every decision I make. He no longer walks beside me, but he remains a part of who I am now. And that is enough for me to keep going.